So what does that mean in future elections? If you say guidelines, and we know that we have so many comments, instructions from INEC a day to election or even on election day, don't you think at the end of the day, if we go on with this, we're setting a bad precedent to the extent that when we conduct an election and any electoral guideline coming from INEC that has not been incorporated into the act wouldn't be,
No, I see,
will be taken for granted by the electorate?
Yes, I agree with you. There are certain guidelines. Guidelines are meant to support the law.
Absolutely.
There are certain guidelines that you must incorporate as law. And there are certain guidelines that you have to couch in such a way as not to run contrary to the law or as not to create an independent ground of questioning the process different from what the law has already provided. You bring out guidelines. And if it is, guidelines are there for you to ensure that the process works smoothly, but it is not to ensure that the clear provisions of the law are upturned. Right. We have an opportunity at the Court of Appeal to look at these things. And anyhow the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court treats it, we still have rights as lawyers to question some of the decisions. For example, I am also questioning the decision of the Supreme Court that says that relocation to Abuja based on the doctrine of necessity was right. I am saying that the Supreme Court ought to have averted its mind to different situations. For example, can the same security not be provided for the tribunal members inside of Rivers State or Akwa Ibom? And again, bearing in mind again that there has been an earlier decision, although it's a Court of Appeal decision, which was very explicit, which was very clear, a sound decision of the Court of Appeal in Igbori against Ogboru, where the court defined in as used in section 285 subsection 2 of the 1999 Constitution and proximity as defined in section 19 subsection 2 of the first schedule of the Electoral Act, now section 20 subsection 2 of the first schedule of the Electoral Act, proximity in time and place to the place where the election was held. And you look at accessibility to the people who are to come before the panel. So I think that, yes, the Supreme Court is the final arbiter in this decision. And we must respect the decision of the Supreme Court. But I, as a person, I think that decision can be queried, can be criticized.
All right, about Abia State, let's just bring this in. We did get a correspondent to find out what exactly the position is in terms of when the ruling will be about the governorship election. So she got across to the registrar, who then says no date has been fixed for that yet for the governorship election. So that's the latest information from the registrar at the tribunal. So when that does happen, I think we'll be able to get it out.
Yes.
But in terms of some of the other cases and comments that they've also muted, having been through the first stage of the tribunal for those who can go to the second instance, they talk about the burden of proof.
Yes.
Suggesting that maybe it should be shifted to he who is alleged to have done it to prove it, as opposed to he who alleges should prove.
It's a funny situation. We have mooted that idea that INEC should have a responsibility, a burden to show that it conducted the election substantially in compliance with the extant laws. That ought to be the situation. But in the law now, if you as a petitioner come forward to say that the election was not conducted in substantial compliance with the law, the burden is upon you to show that. Yes, what the responsibility should be on INEC. Sometimes you find that INEC just comes to the court, comes to the tribunal and folds his hands and allow the parties argue their cases, and they just adopt one position or the other as convenient for them. So that makes it a lazy route for INEC. What INEC should do is, at all times, in my view, and it also touches on amending the laws, INEC should be made to, at all times, be ready to show before a tribunal that it has conducted an election in substantial compliance with the law. And if it fails to dispense with that burden, then it can shift. It can be said that yes, he didn't do his job, and the tribunal would give judgment as it deems fit. But if it successfully dispenses with that responsibility, then it shifts to the petitioner, who is saying that. But presently, the law is that there's a presumption that as soon as there's a declaration of the law, there's a presumption that INEC is saying that there is a substantial compliance with the law.
Because some of the petitioners allege that they often find it difficult for the commission to furnish them with all the necessary materials they need, which makes it difficult.
That is the reason why it should be on INEC to come out and present all the materials. And that is why it should limit the materials it uses for elections to the barest minimum, and that is where technology-based election comes in. It should limit the materials it uses for elections to the barest minimum, so that it will be easy for it to present it to a tribunal that look at it. We have substantially complied with the law. But as it is, you have volumes and volumes of paperwork, and yes.
Okay, let me jump to INEC and future elections now, because the last time, by the way, INEC, maybe they will much later, publishing the, what do you call it now, the reports about how the last elections held. Now we have a new INEC chairman, so many will be looking to see if that will happen. But then in the days ahead, in the future elections, should the National Assembly be looking at amending the Electoral Act such that we can have electronic voting?
Yes, absolutely so. I have written an article to that respect, and it was published some time ago in some newspapers. There is an absolute need for us to go electronic voting. Yes, there are problems associated with electronic voting, but I think the National Assembly should amend the Electoral Act to accept of electronic voting, and in that situation you find that Nigerians in diaspora would also be able to vote. Now, electronic voting will come with its own challenges, but I think that INEC shouldn't wait for the presidential election. That was the mistake it made with the card reader and the panel voters card. He used it as a trial in a presidential election, an election that was as serious as a presidential election. He ought to have used it from, it ought to have gone from a graduated position, from the lowest level of election to the median level, and before it gets to the upper level. So I think that technology-based electoral processes should be instituted in our laws, and should be started from the lower level, tested and corrected until we are close to where we want it to be. Then we can test it at the presidential level.
How can we quickly do this with the new National Assembly?
Well, I don't know if this is the forum to talk about the National Assembly, because if I get your question correctly, it may just mean to...
It borders on amendment. It borders on amendment.
Yes. It may border on my asking myself the question: is this National Assembly really ready to do its job as the National Assembly?
You don't think they are?
No, that's why I'm saying that it's a different question altogether. In my view, from what is going on in the National Assembly today, what I saw of the ministerial screening, Senator Dino Melaya, a respected friend of mine, somebody that I respect so much, told us on air that there will be no more business as usual in the confirmation, the screening of ministerial nominees. But we saw even more usual than was usual in the screening. It was a bow and go era in our Senate. There was nothing to show that there was serious intention to really go out from what used to be. So I hope. Sorry, let me conclude this. So I hope that my views here are wrong as to get the National Assembly to amend our laws to accommodate technology-based electoral processes.
Yeah, but the question is, are you being fair to the senators on that? Because, I mean, for some people, this is about the most thorough they've seen.
That is to some people. What is thorough about it? There is, in fact...
What did you want to see? I mean,
in point of fact, there have
grilled,
been in previous...
asked questions, asked to give account of their previous administrations, as it were. If you ever served in public office, you were asked to give an account of yourself. What more were you expecting? There
were examples of ministerial nominees who were questioned on issues that bordered on impropriety, on probably crime, touching on crime. And INEC, the Senate glossed over it. There are a lot of examples inside of the Senate chambers with regards to the screening.
Give us one.
I can't give you names now. You know it.
No.
You know some of them. Okay, let me give you an example. There is an example of an indictment. There's an example of an indictment, a matter that is before a court. And one of the rules of the Senate says that the Senate shall not do anything regarding any matter which has been submitted to a court of competent jurisdiction. And in any case, a particular provision of the Constitution clearly provides that when there has been an indictment of a person by a judicial or administrative commission of inquiry, and the state or federal government has accepted that report and has published it in its gazette or white paper, that person stands.
Mr. Ikeji,
Yes.
just a moment. You have cited one instance which does not border on whether or not the Senate actually questioned, that particular individual, because the Senate, first of all, set up an ethics committee as it should, which submitted a report before it. And when this particular individual, which you mentioned, came before the Senate, there were still questions asked, even bordering on that.
That is the question. You have
impropriety
already jumped beyond the point that you should jump. There ought not to be questions. They ought to have held action. That is the point. For you to admit that they have asked questions means that you have already gone beyond where they should have gone beyond. They ought to have held action.
Just a moment.
No, you get it first.
No, just a moment. What we're talking about was the screening.
Yes.
The general screening.
It ought not to have been screened.
Just a moment. You said that what you saw was bow and go almost throughout. That was what you said.
Yes.
And I asked for one example.
Those questions were more like generic questions. They were questions that anybody who has a degree can answer.
Okay, well,
they ought not to have gone into the confirmation screening of such persons. There are also other questions that border on crimes and impropriety that the Senate ought also have dug deep.
And so just a moment. And so for one individual, you condemn the entire screening?
Not for one individual. I said there are other examples.
Thank you, Mr. Ikeji. That's a wrap today on the program. We thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chamberlain.
And that's it today on the show. We'll be back tomorrow as well. So not over for the week. We still have extra. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'm Chamberlain Uso.
Well, it feels like Friday, I must say. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Maofwe Ogun.
Many thanks, Sulaiman. Let us see you again tomorrow.